Welcome to another episode of the Truthful Fake Podcast. Please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Since the early 2010s, American politics has entered a turbulent cycle defined by intense polarization, shifting party identities, and battles over cultural values. To understand how we got here, we need to examine the historical currents that have shaped today's landscape, from one-party dominance and institutional complacency to the rise of a new ideological woke orthodoxy, to the backlash in the form of populism. We'll explore how decades of Democratic control in Congress fostered a bitter partisan reaction, how personal demonization became a staple of political combat, and how quasi-religious fervor for ideological purity emerged in academia and beyond. We'll also examine recent flashpoints, from the 2020 unrest and pandemic policies to the role of primary elections in amplifying extremes. For nearly 40 years after the mid-1950s, Democrats held an uninterrupted majority in the House of Representatives. This prolonged one-party rule bred institutional complacency. With the same party controlling the agenda for decades, House leadership grew comfortable and unaccountable, and procedures calcified under unchallenged Democratic dominance. Meanwhile, Republicans were relegated to a permanent minority role, with some of the newer members growing resentful as they watched from the sidelines. That frustration eventually fueled a backlash that radicalized many voters who felt disenfranchised. Some Republican strategists saw the Gun Control Act of 1968 and the controversial Roe v. Wade decision as an opportunity to politicize gun control and abortion to attract conservative Democrats. Ambitious GOP figures like Newt Gingrich in the 1980s began attacking the entrenched Democratic regime as corrupt and out of touch, buoyed by what many saw as Democrat abuses of power during the Bork hearings and the threats of procedural denial of a Supreme Court appointment to President George Herbert Walker Bush. Then the threat of the Soviet Union came to an end and left the rising cultural divergencies as focal points of differentiation for both major parties. Gingrich's confrontational tactics finally broke the Democrats' long hold on power, culminating in the 1994 Republican takeover of the House. But the demise of the 5 decades of Democrat control of the House ushered in an era of intense partisan warfare and led to zero-sum battles between the parties, paving the way to the bitter polarization we see today. Over the past half-century, political discourse has grown increasingly venomous, often driven by personal demonization of opponents. This trend has largely been fueled by the left casting Republican leaders as not just wrong, but evil. During the Nixon era, for example, anti-Nixon activists depicted him as a uniquely sinister figure, Tricky Dick, the would-be tyrant, beyond normal political reproach. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was similarly vilified by many on the left, portrayed as a stupid actor, heartless warmonger, and an extremist, rather than simply a conservative with different views. This pattern reached its apex with Donald Trump. From the moment he emerged, Trump was castigated in unprecedented terms, labeled a racist, a fascist, and later a traitor under Russian control. Those on the left, aided by the media, portrayed him and openly treated him as an existential threat to American democracy. To be sure, Trump's own incendiary rhetoric, including statements implying a refusal to recognize an electoral loss, were unprecedented in recent history and raised red flags across the political spectrum. But the immediate all-out personal assault against him, such as the post-inauguration Women's March on Washington where participants chanted, "He is not my president," was an unacknowledged harbinger of things to come, including the January 6, 2021 Capitol protest and riot. The left's resistance movement and the Russiagate attack and went far beyond policy disagreements. They aimed to destroy Trump's legitimacy entirely and shook the foundations of American democracy. By framing Republican presidents and their supporters as monsters and enemies, the Democrats essentially justified extraordinary resistance tactics and shattered the norms of political civility. In turn, this encouraged a similar demonizing impulse on the right. The result is a toxic cycle. If each side sees the other as an existential evil, compromise becomes impossible and politics turns into a fight to the finish. In parallel with partisan battles, a cultural upheaval was brewing in academia, the rise of the woke movement and post-Marxist identity politics. What began on college campuses as group identity-based activism evolved into a kind of secular religion focused on ethnicity, gender, and race, increasingly demanding ideological purity. Its doctrine divided people into oppressors and oppressed, based on identity traits, and it demanded strict adherence to a constantly shifting moral code. Like a religion, it had concepts of sin, privilege, rituals of atonement, public apologies and diversity training, and heresies, any dissent from its orthodox beliefs. Those who question or deviate from woke tenets, be it on race, gender, or sexuality, are not debated. They are denounced as immoral, shunned, and often canceled, cast out from professional or social circles, and their careers often destroyed. This movement quickly spread beyond academia into the broader culture. State bureaucracies, school systems, and corporations absorbed woke ideology through diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that effectively enforce its worldview. In workplaces and government agencies, employees are trained to adopt approved language and beliefs, and voicing an unconventional opinion can risk one's career. The woke ethos now permeates Hollywood, the news media, and tech companies as well, setting narrow bounds on acceptable thought. Under the banner of inclusivity, it has imposed a climate of stringent conformity. Many people fear speaking honestly about sensitive issues, whether illegal migration, crime, or differences between the sexes, lest they be branded bigots and canceled. In effect, a new moral orthodoxy is policing debate in America, aiming to purge dissent and ensure everyone bows to the same ideological line. The turbulence of 2020 further revealed how ideology can override consistent principles. The clearest example was the contrasting treatment of racial justice protests and pandemic restrictions. When George Floyd's death in police custody in May 2020 sparked Black Lives Matter demonstrations across the country, many protests descended into riots. In many cities, buildings were torched, stores looted, and people assaulted and even murdered amid the chaos. Yet many on the left framed these events in forgiving terms, and Democrat politicians blamed the police and joined the defund the police movement. Media outlets emphasized the protests' noble aims and often described them as mostly peaceful, even as fires burned in the background. Progressive politicians rationalized the unrest, calling it an understandable response to systemic racism. Law and order seemed to disintegrate, murder rates and crime spiked, while Democrat mayors forced police officers to kneel in front of the rioters and refused to prosecute violent offenders. That same year, Americans were also under some of the strictest public health edicts in history due to COVID-19. Governors and mayors shut down businesses, schools, and churches, telling people to stay home to save lives. Mask mandates were enforced, and later, vaccine mandates followed, with those who refused often fired. These measures went well beyond what previous scientific consensus had recommended for pandemics. For instance, pre-2020 pandemic plans rarely included total lockdowns or prolonged school closures due to their high societal costs. But COVID was politicized by the left, and anyone who questioned the wisdom of these policies risked being denounced as anti-science, grandma killer, or ignorant and an enemy of society. The left's double standard became glaring. The same public health experts who warned against any gathering of people because of the virus made an exception for the BLM marches. A large group of media-anointed experts even signed an open letter saying that fighting perceived systemic racism was so important, it outweighed the COVID risk of mass protests. This politicization of science, endorsing one kind of mass gathering while condemning others, severely undermined public trust. It signaled that following the science was, in fact, following a preferred ideological narrative. Moreover, debate about pandemic policy was aggressively policed and censored. Social media companies, at the urging of government officials, censored viewpoints that challenged lockdowns or mask mandates as misinformation. Doctors who advocated alternative approaches, like focused protection for the vulnerable instead of blanket lockdowns, were shunned or maligned, and many lost their jobs. Primary elections themselves also fuel polarization by rewarding the most ideologically extreme factions in each party. Rather than serving as moderating forces, today's primary contests often punish centrists and empower hardliners. Several factors contribute to this dynamic. Base domination. Primary turnout is low and dominated by the most passionate partisans. In safe districts, where the general election is a foregone conclusion, nominees are effectively chosen by a small, ideologically driven slice of voters. Candidates tailor their appeals to these base voters, often taking uncompromising positions to survive the primary, even if those stances alienate moderates. Single-issue influence. The 2010 Supreme Court decision in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission paved the way for well-funded interest groups to sway primaries by bankrolling friendly candidates and targeting those they oppose. For example, the pro-Israel lobby group AIPAC has poured millions into some Democratic primaries to defeat candidates deemed insufficiently pro-Israel. Likewise, on the right, both AIPAC and organizations focused on gun rights or abortion will mobilize to unseat any Republican who isn't deemed pure enough. This outsized influence of single-issue groups means politicians live in fear of crossing certain litmus tests. Fear of being primaried. Incumbents know that even a slight deviation from party orthodoxy can invite a fierce primary challenger. A Democratic lawmaker who shows too much independence might face a challenge from the far left in the next election cycle, while a Republican who compromises can be attacked from the Trumpist right. This threat keeps many officials in rigid lockstep with their party's increasingly extreme-based positions, lest they lose their careers in a primary upset. Over time, these effects have hollowed out the political center. The primary system, intended as a democratic reform, has instead become a major driver of polarization, elevating candidates who play to the fringes and sidelining those who might govern from the middle. Donald Trump's rise to the presidency in 2016 can be seen as a populist backlash against what many perceived as left-wing overreach and authoritarianism. By that time, a large segment of Americans had grown weary of political correctness, woke speech codes, and a sense that elites in media and tech were controlling what people could say or even read. Trump capitalized on this resentment. He presented himself as a brash outsider willing to attack the sacred cows of the establishment. He railed against the mainstream media, mocked identity politics, and promised to give voice to those who felt silenced by the woke machine and ignored by the coastal elites of limousine liberals. A key grievance driving Trump's support was the issue of censorship. There was a growing belief that left-leaning institutions were stifling information and debate. A vivid example came in the 2020 campaign, when major media outlets and social media companies suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story, dismissing it, without real evidence, as Russian disinformation. That incident, along with later revelations from the Twitter files showing government agencies leaning on tech platforms to mute certain stories, confirmed suspicions that free speech was under threat from the left. Even before those specifics emerged, Trump's base felt that academia, Hollywood, and Silicon Valley had long colluded to marginalize conservative voices. Trump's blunt rejection of that regime, his willingness to say things that would get others canceled, was precisely why his supporters loved him. At the same time, the Democratic Party's shift leftward left many moderate and working-class voters feeling politically homeless. Traditional centrist Democrats saw their party increasingly dominated by far-left ideologues and identity-focused agendas, with less room for Clinton-style pragmatism. This erosion of moderation made Trump's outsider message even more potent. In the eyes of his voters, Trump was a necessary counterpunch to militant left-wing elites and a political class that had lost touch with common Americans. His victory was a loud repudiation of the direction the left had pushed society and the political culture. The Republican Party itself has been transformed over the past 2 decades, culminating in Trump's populist takeover. Under President George W. Bush in the early 2000s, the GOP began drifting from its Goldwater-Reagan small government roots. Bush launched the war against Iraq as part of a strongly pro-Israel neoconservative foreign policy agenda that aligned with Netanyahu's goal to end the possibility of a two-state solution and use American power to reshape the Middle East and make it safe for an expansionist Israel. George W. Bush nearly doubled government spending compared to Bill Clinton, with discretionary spending rising by 96% between 2002 and 2009. Prominent classical liberal and libertarian-leaning Republicans were alienated by this big government social conservatism, and by the rush into a war that squandered the soft power of the United States and proved counter to our geopolitical interests. The growing, if unfocused, disillusionment with the war and the 2008 financial crisis triggered a populist wave that swept in after Bush left office, with the Tea Party movement in 2009 demanding lower taxes, less spending, and a return to constitutional limits. This grassroots rebellion signaled hunger for change within the GOP, but the party's establishment still held sway through the 2012 election. Trump's arrival in 2015 shattered the old guard. Running against forever wars, free trade deals, and the GOP establishment itself, Trump tapped into blue-collar nationalism, rising isolationism, and cultural resentment that party elites had long overlooked. He defeated a slate of conventional Republicans and fundamentally reshaped the party's platform. Under Trump's populism, the GOP turned more skeptical of free trade, more isolationist in foreign affairs, except for Trump's ever-stronger pro-Netanyahu stance, and more willing to wield government power in the economy, imposing tariffs and threatening non-conforming corporations not unlike the subsequent Biden regime. This was a sharp departure from the party's prior identity as the champion of free markets, free trade, and hawkish free world internationalism. In the process, many classical liberal and neoconservative Republicans were cast aside. Influential figures from the pre-Trump era, Mitt Romney, various think tank intellectuals, and even the Bush family, found themselves isolated or even exiting the party. Loyalty to Trump and alignment with his own persona and vision became the defining test for Republican officials. By the end of Trump's term, the GOP was effectively remade, no longer the party of Chamber of Commerce corporate liberalism, but a party fueled by working-class populist energy and an anti-establishment, nationalist ethos. The Russia collusion investigation, Russiagate, that plagued Trump's presidency is a telling case of false narratives and institutional bias. In the hysteria after the Democrats' election loss of 2016, much of the press embraced and amplified the theory that Trump had conspired with the Kremlin to win the election. Years of breathless reporting ensued, built on dubious leaks and the infamous Steele dossier, all suggesting Trump was a puppet of Moscow. But virtually all was based on Democrat-driven conspiracy theories and innuendo, and when Special Counsel Robert Mueller concluded his probe in 2019, he found no evidence of any criminal conspiracy between Trump's team and Russia. The sweeping collusion narrative had largely been a mirage created to delegitimize Trump. Even the Columbia Journalism Review, in a lengthy 2023 analysis, delivered a scathing indictment of how major news organizations handled the story, faulting them for abandoning skepticism in favor of a preconceived ideological tale. Many conservatives saw it as proof that mainstream media would push dubious stories to take down Trump, while many on the left to this day still believe something must have been afoot, despite the lack of proof. Trump's own erratic behavior, then and now, fuels such beliefs. Russiagate also revealed partisan misconduct deep within government ranks. The FBI's political pursuit of the Trump campaign included surveillance warrants that were later shown to be improperly obtained. In one egregious instance, an FBI attorney, Kevin Kleinsmith, deliberately falsified an email to hide the fact that a Trump associate, Carter Page, had been an informant for the CIA. By altering that document, Kleinsmith enabled the FBI to continue spying on Page under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Kleinsmith eventually pleaded guilty to forging evidence, a gross abuse of power with dangerous consequences. Yet Kleinsmith received only probation, and astonishingly, in a clearly ideologically based decision, the Washington, D.C. bar reinstated his law license after a brief suspension. The legal establishment, dominated by people sympathetic to the Russiagate narrative, seemed eager to forgive this criminal act because it targeted Th. To Trump's supporters, this was blatant confirmation that there are two standards of justice, one for anti-Trump operatives and another for everyone else. The entire Russiagate episode, from media excesses to FBI misdeeds, shows how deeply the rulebook was bent in the crusade against Trump, and how that, in turn, has fed public cynicism and division. For the first time in U.S. history, a former president and a front-running opposition candidate faced an onslaught of criminal and civil prosecutions, what Trump's allies called lawfare, at least some clearly unlikely to withstand higher court appeals. Since leaving office, Trump was indicted in multiple jurisdictions. Alvin Bragg, a New York DA who ran an election campaign promising to get Trump, used a novel legal theory to charge him over hush money payments to an adult film actress. A Georgia district attorney indicted him and associates for trying to overturn Georgia's 2020 election results, based on rather dubious evidence. And a federal special counsel brought cases related to Trump's handling of classified documents and his actions. Around January 6th, supporters of these efforts insist that no one is above the law, but to tens of millions of Americans, it looked blatantly political. They saw a coordinated attempt to use the courts to do what opponents couldn't do at the ballot box: sideline Trump and prevent him from returning to power. While such tactics are common in authoritarian regimes and banana republics, in the U.S. this was an unprecedented use of the justice system against a leading presidential contender in the midst of a campaign. The spectacle further polarized the country. Trump's detractors cheered what they believed was legal comeuppance, while his supporters and many in the middle saw it as another of the left's attempts to rig the system. Even Trump's lawyers became targets, a trend that alarmed civil libertarians. Several attorneys who worked on Trump's post-election legal challenges or who defended him faced professional sanctions and career-threatening reprisals. Rudy Giuliani, once a celebrated mayor, had his law license suspended for defending Trump's election fraud claims in court. John Eastman, a constitutional lawyer who advised Trump on contesting electors, is facing disbarment proceedings in California. Other lawyers associated with Trump's election fight have been hit with bar complaints or even criminal charges. Punishing lawyers for the alleged misdeeds of their client or for making legal arguments in his defense sets a dangerous precedent. The legal profession appears politicized. Attorneys on one side of a partisan divide are being systematically discredited. The fear is that this lawfare will become the norm. Today, a Republican leader is targeted, and tomorrow, perhaps a Democrat will be. We are already seeing Trump doing something similar. Weaponizing the justice system against political opponents is a hallmark of unstable democracies, not a healthy one. It is yet another front in the erosion of norms, threatening lasting damage to the principle of impartial justice. In 2024, Trump saw another opportunity to paint the Democrats into a corner. A particularly intense front in the culture wars was the debate over transgender issues, and here, dissenting opinions are often aggressively silenced. On the left, a dogma had taken hold. One must fully affirm gender self-identification, even to the point of supporting life-altering medical interventions for minors and allowing transgender women, biological males, to compete in women's sports. Anyone who questioned these positions risked severe repercussions. We saw doctors and educators who raised concerns about prescribing puberty blockers or surgeries to children quickly labeled as transphobic and threatened with the loss of their careers. In sports, female athletes who objected to competing against biologically male competitors, pointing out the undeniable physical advantages, were shouted down and punished. A high school coach in Oregon was reportedly fired after writing letters to athletic officials questioning whether it was fair for a male-born runner to race against girls. The message in these episodes was that disagreement will not be tolerated. Even prominent figures were not immune. Celebrated authors and academics who voiced nuanced reservations about aspects of gender ideology faced social media firestorms and professional exile. The result was a chilling effect across academia, medicine, and journalism. Many people privately harbored doubts about the new orthodoxy on gender, but few dared to speak openly. They had seen others cast out of their jobs or defamed for doing so. This heavy-handed suppression of debate meant policies affecting children's health and women's rights were often implemented without full scrutiny. It also underscored an authoritarian streak within the woke left, a belief that one side's moral stance is so unquestionably correct that any dissent must be stamped out. In a healthy society, controversial issues demand open discussion, but the left punished open inquiry, to the detriment of science and public trust. Since taking office for his second term in January 2025, President Donald Trump has pursued an aggressive foreign policy agenda that has dramatically reshaped America's relationships with key allies and adversaries, particularly in his dealings with Ukraine, Russia's Vladimir Putin, and Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. His actions reflect a continuation of his populist, deal-making persona, but they have sparked controversy for their apparent prioritization of personal relationships and strategic concessions over traditional U.S. alliances. Notably, Trump's policies have leaned heavily in favor of Israel, while his approach to Ukraine suggests a willingness to pressure Kyiv into concessions that could effectively surrender Ukrainian sovereignty to Putin's Russia. Trump's relationship with Netanyahu has been marked by unwavering support, positioning Israel as a cornerstone of his foreign policy. He has expedited military aid to Israel in its ongoing conflict with Hamas, signing orders to release munitions previously held up by the Biden administration. Netanyahu has publicly praised Trump as Israel's greatest friend, highlighting the delivery of weapons to finish the job against the Palestinians, which are described as part of Iran's terror axis. Beyond military support, Trump has taken steps that critics argue suppress criticism of Israel. Trump's administration has imposed policies that penalize anti-Israel speech in America, including threats of deportation for pro-Palestinian activists and support for blacklisting students and academics who criticize Israel's actions in Gaza. Trump's actions align with the strong pro-Israel influence that groups like AIPAC exert on him, and which more broadly continue to shape U.S. political discourse by targeting candidates perceived as insufficiently supportive of Israel. This has created a chilling effect, silencing voices from both sides of the political spectrum through well-funded personal and political attacks, echoing the left's cancel culture tactics. In contrast, Trump's dealings with Ukraine and Putin have raised alarms among European allies and Ukrainian officials, who fear he is prepared to sacrifice Ukraine's sovereignty for a quick deal with Russia. Trump has openly pressured Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to accept territorial concessions, including the possibility of recognizing Russia's annexation of Crimea and ceding occupied regions in eastern Ukraine. His administration has initiated direct talks with Putin, often excluding Kyiv, and signaled that Ukraine's NATO membership and full territorial restoration are unrealistic. Trump's rhetoric has at times echoed Kremlin talking points, such as blaming Ukraine for prolonging, and even for starting the war, and criticizing Zelensky for not holding elections during wartime. While Trump has expressed some frustration with Putin's intransigence, threatening tariffs on Russian oil exports if no deal is reached, his overall approach suggests a transactional willingness to prioritize a symbolic peace over Ukraine's long-term security. This has led to accusations that Trump is effectively pushing for Ukraine's surrender, emboldening Putin and undermining decades of U.S. policy aimed at countering Russian aggression, possibly to extract Russian cooperation in Trump's and Netanyahu's plan for reshaping the Middle East and solving the Palestinian problem in favor of Israel. In recent years, free speech itself has become a politicized battleground. Under attack from the left, Trump and many conservatives cast themselves as defenders of free expression, vowing to end cancel culture when elected, and accusing big tech and universities of silencing voices on the right. Ironically, under pressure from Trump and powerful interest groups, many of the same left-leaning institutions that once cheered canceling and banning hateful or misleading conservative speech are now turning their censorship tools against voices within their own camp. Nothing illustrated the shift more clearly than the fallout from the 2023 Israel-Hamas war. When that conflict erupted, many students, academics, and activists spoke out against Israel's military response in Gaza, condemning it as disproportionate or inhumane, and calling for Israel to allow the formation of a Palestinian state. A few appeared to cheer the Hamas violence, and some engaged in illegal property takeovers, which were dealt with more aggressively than previous similar incidents, such as those that occurred during the BLM riots. The pro-Israel forces within the United States were quick to adopt the woke movement's methods. They exaggerated minor incidents through sympathetic media, published the names of protesters and students at elite universities who signed letters critical of Israel quickly, had job offers rescinded, and were blacklisted by employers. Professors who spoke out against Israel's actions were suspended or put under investigation. On social media, pro-Palestinian content was scrubbed as hate speech or misinformation. In short, American institutions, from academia to corporate boards, deployed the same cancel culture tactics to silence criticism of Israel that they previously used to silence voices on the right. Trump has now made pro-Israel censorship a core part of his policies, demanding surveillance of foreign visitors' social media accounts, and even adding the threat of deportation for those who dare to speak out against Israel's atrocities against the Palestinians. This turn of events underscores that censorship is a double-edged sword. The apparatus built to police speech in one context will inevitably be used in others. Liberals who were comfortable censoring what they deemed right-wing extremism have found that now their own anti-war or human rights arguments can be labeled unacceptable. It's a bitter lesson. Once the norm of open debate is compromised, no one's speech is safe when the political winds shift. The controversy over Israel created strange bedfellows. Some progressives are suddenly sounding like free speech advocates after feeling the sting of suppression, while conservatives point out that the left's censorship impulse has boomeranged. For American society, it's a stark reminder that free expression must be defended consistently, not just when it aligns with one's own politics. Looking abroad, the trajectory of American politics increasingly resembles the polarization and institutional decay seen in parts of Latin America. Venezuela is a stark example. Once a relatively stable democracy, it fell under Hugo Chávez's populist rule in the late 1990s. Chávez demonized opponents as traitors, rewrote the constitution to entrench his power, packed the courts, and crushed dissent in the media. The result was a downward spiral. Venezuela today is an authoritarian regime in economic ruin, where elections are a sham and opposition leaders are jailed or exiled. The United States is far stronger, but we can see similar seeds: the routine branding of opponents as enemies, talk of bending rules to secure power, and a zero-sum mentality in politics. Brazil offers another cautionary parallel. That country has seesawed between left-wing and right-wing populism, and the clash almost unraveled its democracy. A corruption scandal tarnished the leftist establishment and propelled Jair Bolsonaro, a hard-right firebrand, to the presidency. Bolsonaro refused to accept defeat when he lost re-election, alleging that the election was rigged and pointing to the opacity of vote counting and the lack of an auditable paper trail. Brazil remains deeply divided, with each faction treating the other as illegitimate. The lesson is that democracies can die from within when polarization goes unchecked. When politicians treat rivals as mortal enemies and each camp believes it must win at any cost, the guardrails of democracy come loose. The same forces of populism and institutional mistrust are at play in the United States. Currently, Trump's base celebrates his strongman tactics, his blindly pro-Israel stance, and even his seemingly bizarre relationship with Russia's own strongman, Putin. Critics, including some Republicans, warn of eroded alliances, lost credibility, and severe damage to America's standing and geopolitical interests, and the further erosion of democratic norms that were already under attack by the left. Trump's apparent double standard, championing free speech when it suits his agenda, but ordering censorship. Firings and deportations against critics of a foreign country's policies has fueled debates about betrayal of trust and growing authoritarian tendencies. As Trump navigates these political flashpoints, his erratic and self-aggrandizing approach risks further alienating moderate voters, who have little choice but to hold their nose and vote for what they perceive as the lesser evil, just like they did when they voted for Trump. Trump, and the far left before him, are pushing American society ever closer to the zero-sum political dynamics seen in polarized and failed nations, where personal loyalty, tribal codes, and ideological purity overshadow institutional stability. The polarizing effects of the primary system and the large influence multiplier of well-funded single-issue interest groups are destabilizing factors that are likely to remain in the system for the foreseeable future. Thank you for listening. If you found this analysis informative, please like, share, and subscribe for more.